Have you ever wondered how to take super sharp photos? Well, as an amateur myself, I know how frustrating it can be to come home after working really hard with blurry, soft images, even when you felt like in the field in the moment you were doing everything right. But don't worry, I've learned a few tricks that I think can help you get crazy sharp photos with any camera. So let's start with the basics. What exactly does it mean for a photo to be sharp? Well, it's all about capturing the fine detail and crisp edges in your images. Think of it like focusing a microscope. The sharper the image, the more that you can see all those tiny, intricate details. Now, there are a few key reasons why your photos might be coming out soft or blurry. First off, you might be using a shutter speed that's too slow to freeze the action. This is especially common in low light situations where your camera is struggling to gather enough light, and so it's leaving the shutter open for a longer period. Secondly, your subject just could be moving way too quick for the shutter speed that you've selected, causing motion blur. And lastly, you might be having issues with focus itself. Either your camera is focusing on the wrong thing, or your lens just isn't capable of capturing sharp images. So that's the basics, right? But how do we fix these issues? Well, I've got a checklist of tips that I always run through when I'm trying to get tack sharp photos. And again, as a real amateur here, point number 4 that we're going to cover in this video was a real game changer for me when I started doing it. So stick around for that one and let's dive right in. First things first, let's talk about ISO. So ISO is your camera sensor's sensitivity to light. The lower the ISO number, the less sensitive it is. And the higher the number, the more sensitive, but also the more noise you're going to get in your image. Now, when I'm out doing landscape photography up in the mountains, I always start by setting my camera to the lowest native ISO. For most cameras, including my Sony a7R IV, that's around ISO 100. This is going to give you the cleanest, sharpest images possible. Now, of course, in low light situations, you might need to bump up that ISO to get a fast enough shutter speed. But be careful, the higher you go, the more noise and grain you're going to start to see in your photos. And it's not that high ISO makes your images less sharp. It's that because of the higher noise, there is less detail captured by the sensor. Think of it like this. For every random pixel of noise, there are going to be less pixels accurately representing the scene that you're trying to capture. And this gives the appearance of a softer photo when you get home, take the memory card out, stick it in your computer, and you review your images and look at them with disappointment. For me personally, I try not to go above ISO 3200 if I can help it. Sometimes you've got to do what you've got to do to get the shot right. Sometimes a slightly softer, more noisy image is better than no image at all. And speaking of getting the image at all costs, let's move on to the next point. Okay, so you've got your ISO set. Next up, we're talking about shutter speed. And if you shoot handheld without a tripod or some kind of stabling device, there's a really handy rule of thumb that you can use to make sure that your shutter speed is fast enough to avoid camera shake that, of course, when your camera's shaking around because in your hands, it's going to make your images look softer. It's called the hand holding rule. Basically, you want your shutter speed to be at least the inverse of your focal length. So if you're shooting with a 100mm lens, you'll want a shutter speed of at least 1/100th of a second. If you've got a cropped sensor camera like my Fujifilm X-T5, which is an APS-C sensor, then you'll need to account for that crop factor within your calculation. So a 100mm lens on a 1.5 times crop sensor, for example my Fuji camera, would need a shutter speed of about 1/150th of a second to get a sharp photo. Now, this is just a guideline, and of course, some people will have steadier hands than others. But in general, following this rule will help you avoid really blurry, shaky photos, if movement of the camera was causing them. And if you have particularly shaky hands, or you're shooting a very static subject like I do in landscape photography, I've got a massively obvious yet underutilized tip that I'm going to share with you in a minute. But what if you're in a situation where you need control over the depth of field, as well as the shutter speed and the ISO? That's where choosing the right camera mode starts to come into play. All right, so we've covered ISO and we've covered shutter speed, but what about aperture? Well, when it comes to getting sharp photos, I actually prefer to shoot in aperture priority mode most of the time. This lets me control my depth of field and lets the camera then choose an appropriate shutter speed for me. In low light situations, I'll usually set my aperture as wide as it'll go, somewhere between f1.4 and f4, depending on the lens, as this is going to let in the most light possible and helps me keep my shutter speed up. Just be careful with your focusing when you're shooting wide open. Your depth of field is going to be very, very shallow if you've got a very fast lens. So you've got to make sure that, if you're doing a portrait, you're focused on the person's eye as opposed to you're focusing on the back of the head and everything's going to be blurry and a mess. But if you can nail that focus, you're going to get some incredibly sharp images with that gorgeous, creamy bokeh that people on YouTube seem to absolutely love for some reason. Now, of course, there's more to Aperture than always selecting the most wide open f-stop, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But if you really want to take your sharpness to the next level, then there's one more setting on your camera that you should absolutely both know about and probably implement. If your camera has an auto ISO feature, I highly recommend using it, especially if you're just starting out and you're an amateur, you're a beginner like me. Auto ISO will let you set a minimum shutter speed, and then the camera will automatically raise or lower the ISO if it needs more or less light or sensitivity on the sensor to get a photo. It's a great way to make sure that you're not accidentally letting your shutter speed get too low and then you're going to end up with a blurry photo. And take it from me, you may have been there as well, I've definitely been here. When you're out in the field, you're enjoying whatever you're taking photographs of, sometimes it can be pretty easy to lose track of all the settings that I've just described to you. ISO, shutter speed, aperture, then you've got eye detect, animal detect, all these kind of different focusing modes. It can become just too much for the mere mortal to comprehend. So it's usually best to simplify your process, and that's where, for me, auto ISO is a real game changer. Which leads us to some perhaps less technical, but equally, if not more important ways to increase the sharpness of our images. Now, admittedly, this might seem a little bit obvious, but it surprises me every time. It's incredible how much of a difference proper camera holding technique can make to your photos. And this isn't rocket science. You want to hold the camera with both your hands. I typically hold the grip and then the lens. You want to tuck your elbows close into your body for stability. And if you can, get the camera right up on your face, because your head is a big heavy object that isn't moving or shaking around very much. And even better, if you can lean against something sturdy like a wall or a tree, that's when you're going to be the most fixed. The camera is fixed tight to you, and that's when you're going to take the sharpest photos with the least camera shake. Additionally, and of course, we're not like world-class snipers here doing competitions or blowing people's heads off at 3-mile distance. But when you're taking your photo, try not to jab down on the shutter. That can cause a bunch of subtle camera shake. Instead, gently squeeze the button. And trust me, it might feel a little bit awkward at first, but when you get used to it, it's going to become second nature. And so, don't make life more difficult for you and your camera and all the fancy technology inside of it by waving your camera around in the air as you take your photos. So get tight when you take your photos and press the shutter softly, gently, if you want to reduce some of that shake that you get from your hands. Now, let's talk about something that is just as important as how you hold your camera, and that is where you focus it. Proper focus is absolutely key to getting sharp photos. Yeah, no will, but I get this wrong all of the time. So, obviously, if your camera's focused on the wrong thing, or if it's not quite nailing the focus, your whole image is going to be soft. And in most cases, I find that single point autofocus works best when I'm aiming for the sharpest photo possible. This lets you tell the camera exactly, almost pinpoint, what you want the camera to focus on. If I'm shooting a portrait, I will focus on the subject's eye to lock that in focus. If I'm doing a landscape photo, I will focus about 1/3 of the way into the shot at something that has high contrast to make it easier for the camera to focus. If perhaps you've got a slightly older camera, which is absolutely still capable of taking incredibly sharp images, but it's having a hard time locking focus, then try using the center focus point on the sensor, or as you look down the viewfinder, and then recompose your shot. The center point is usually the most accurate point for autofocus on a camera. And heck, don't be afraid to switch to manual focus if you need to, especially if you're shooting through obstacles like fences or plants, or there's lots of stuff going on. Autofocus can absolutely easily get confused in those kind of situations. So sometimes it's better just to take control and do the job yourself. Additionally, double check that your images are in focus when you've taken a couple of them, especially if you're taking photos of something that isn't moving, like a landscape image. Get the first shot, open it on your camera, zoom in and make sure it's sharp before you start firing away. There have been a bunch of times that I've got home from a big hike up a mountain to do a bunch of photography up the side of it, only to find I got my composition, I took the first shot, and I kept taking photos with that specific focus point as the light changed around me, and they were all slightly out of focus. Super annoying. But even with perfect focus, you might still end up with blurry photos if your subject isn't a static tree or is moving too fast across the frame as you try and take the image, which leads us to the next point. If you're photographing anything that's moving, whether that's a person, your dog, an athlete, or a car, you're gonna need a fast shutter speed to freeze that motion in place. Otherwise, you're gonna end up with some motion blur, no matter how steady you're holding that camera. Now, exactly how fast you need to go will depend on the speed of your subject. For example, a person walking 1/200th of a second is probably gonna be enough. For a dog running, and I know this from taking loads of photos of my golden retriever, you might need 1/1000th of a second or faster. For something like a race car, Formula 1 car doing 180 miles an hour down a stretch, you're going to need 2,000th of a second or even higher. The key here is to not take my word for it. The key is to experiment and see what works for your specific situation. Take a few shots at different shutter speeds on location with your subject and see what ones come out the sharpest. That's right, similar to the previous point, double check your previous shots are sharp before you get carried away and you're just shooting blurry photos all afternoon. But what happens when you're shooting something that's not moving at all? Well, in that case, you want to use, and you can't see this, but there's clutter all over the floor here. You want to use a tripod of some sort. Yeah, it's dead basic, but always use a tripod if you're shooting something that's not moving, like landscape, like still life, if you can get away with it. A tripod will allow you to get away with a much lower shutter speed and so lower ISO, and essentially all of the things that we've talked about in the video thus far. In fact, I've used a tripod to take tack-sharp photos of landscapes over the course of minutes, not even hundredths of seconds. And personally, if I'm taking a wide angle shot of a landscape, I'm almost always using a tripod. And I know this is a particularly small, lightweight tripod, right? This might come up a mountain with me. I know it's a pain in the ass to carry them around. They're a pain in the ass to set up, but once you get it set up, you've got so much more flexibility of all of your settings, and so you've got the best opportunity to get the sharpest possible shot. Plus, I find a tripod frees up my hands so I can look at the composition, I can move around the shot a little bit. I can sit down and have a sandwich with the camera set up, waiting for the light to come out when I'm doing landscape photography, without worrying about recomposing the shot when the light starts kicking off, or worrying about camera shake. But even with a tripod, there's one more factor that can genuinely really affect your sharpness, and you might not even realize that it's affecting the quality of your photos. So earlier on in the video, I said that in compromising conditions, a wide aperture is going to let in more light and so allow for faster shutter speeds to capture your action. Well, I take some of that back. Wide apertures aren't always the best way to get sharper photos. Did you know, and I didn't know this for the longest time, but did you know that every lens has a sweet spot aperture where it is the sharpest? And it's usually in the middle of its aperture range, around 5.6 or f8 or so. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that you have to shoot at f8 every time you take a photo. There's plenty of times when you're going to want a wider or narrow aperture for creative effects. But if sharpness is absolutely your top priority, it's worth keeping your lens's sweet spot in mind. And this goes against the common wisdom that is constantly shared to me by other landscape photographers that you should always shoot at f16. F16, f16, f16. I've heard that from so many landscape photographers. The goal of that is to increase the depth of field to make sure that your image is in focus from front to back. Well, if I want the sharpest image, I might not use f16. I might use a smaller aperture perhaps. So sometimes I'll do a test shot. I'll zoom in on the image on the back of the camera to see if I can get away with using a sharper aperture and still keep everything in focus from front to back. F16 is not a blanket rule that you have to use every single time. And if you're not sure what your lens's sharpest aperture is, you can try doing some tests. You can set up a static subject, put your camera on a tripod, and take a series of shots at different apertures. Now, sure, maybe it's a somewhat boring and particularly sad way to spend a Saturday afternoon, but you only got to do that test once. Then you know what the sharpest parts of the lens are with regards to your aperture. And so when you want a sharp image, you can focus on using that specific aperture for your specific lens. And with all that said, I've got one final tip for you. And I fall foul of this recording these very YouTube videos every single week like clockwork. So this is an easy one to overlook, but it can make a huge difference to the perceived sharpness of your photos. Obviously, right, if your lens is dirty or it's got smudges on it, it's going to affect the sharpness of the image that the lens helps create. So make sure you're keeping your lenses clean and give them a quick wipe with a microfiber cloth before you start shooting. Keeping my lenses clean is something that I often fail to do when recording these videos. So right now I'm sat in my house in the studio space, right? I'm using a Blackmagic camera and a Sigma lens to record this content. The lens sits behind a teleprompter. So day to day, as I'm in the studio, I can't see the lens if it's dusty or not. But every now and again, I'll remember I should probably keep that lens clean. I'll give it a wipe and wham, like magic, the footage is instantly sharper, it has bolder colors and it has more contrast. And every time I do it and I clean the lens, it makes such a surprising difference to the footage that is gathered from it. And don't forget, this is a camera that's sat on a tripod indoors and gets used a couple of times a week. If you haven't cleaned your lenses for a while and you take them up mountains like what I do, just think how much crap has probably smeared on the front of them. And with that said, a bonus tip here, make sure that your camera's sensor is clean as well. Dust spots on the sensor can and will show up as blurry patches in your photos, especially at smaller apertures. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to improving your photography. If you really want to dive deeper and start taking your photos to the next level, why not click up here on the video on mastering composition? There's no point in taking a sharp image if it's of something that's boring, right?